The wind had teeth that evening. It came down off the ridge in long, rolling gusts, bending the pines sideways, rattling the courthouse windows, cutting straight through the thin walls of the county building, like it had a personal grievance with everything standing upright. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered. The auction had been running for 3 hours. Nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to be the last one standing when it was all over. Cassie Holt sat in the back row with her hands in the pockets of her canvas work jacket boots, flat on the linoleum floor, eyes fixed on the front of the room. She was 34 years old. She had grease under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove a jawline that people described as stubborn, even when she was asleep, and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having learned a long time ago that reacting too early costs you everything. She had driven 40 minutes from her rental unit above the garage in Delwood to get here. She had read every page of the property listing 3 times. She had driven past the iron gate at the end of the gravel road twice on 2 separate afternoons, both times slowing, both times feeling something she couldn't name pull at the center of her chest like a hook. Not fear, not exactly. Something older than fear. The feeling an engine makes just before it turns over, when all the compression is right and the timing is right and you know it's about to catch, but it hasn't yet. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Lot 14, he said, Stonehaven Estate. 3-story stone structure, circa 1919. 12.4 acres of mixed woodland and ridge terrain. Copper Falls Township, Harlan County, West Virginia. He paused, shuffled his papers, didn't look up. Opening bid is set at 75 cents, he said, per county code delinquent tax property. The room did not move. Cassie counted 7 other people in those folding chairs. A lawyer in a gray suit who had bid aggressively on the first 3 lots and was now studying his phone. 2 older men in the center row who hadn't spoken since they arrived. A woman from the county assessor's office taking notes on a clipboard. A young couple near the door who had come in halfway through the session and sat down without making eye contact with anyone. And a heavy-set man near the window, arms crossed, staring at the floor the way men stare at floors when they have already made a decision and are waiting for everyone else to catch up. Nobody raised a hand. The auctioneer looked up from his papers for the first time. He scanned the room slowly, the way a man scans a room when he already knows what he's going to find and doesn't like it. 75 cents, he repeated. Stonehaven Estate. Cassie raised her hand. The sound that followed was not applause. It was not conversation. It was the particular silence that falls over a room when everyone in it knows something that one person doesn't. It was the silence of a room full of people watching someone pull the pin on a grenade and smile while they did it. The lawyer looked up from his phone. The 2 older men exchanged a glance so brief and so loaded it could have filled a book. The woman from the assessor's office stopped writing and held her pen in midair, suspended. The heavy-set man by the window finally looked up from the floor, studied Cassie for a long, measuring moment, and then looked back down at the floor. The young couple near the door stood up quietly and left without a word, without a look back. Sold, the auctioneer said, his voice flat. Cassie Holt, 75 cents. He said it the way a doctor reads a diagnosis to a patient who came in asking about something minor. At the county clerk's desk, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain took the 3 quarters Cassie set on the counter one at a time, each coin landing with a small, precise click on the laminate surface. She entered the transaction into the computer. She printed the deed. She slid it across the counter in a manila envelope without lifting her eyes from the screen. You sure you want it? She asked. Cassie picked up the envelope. It's my name on the deed now, isn't it? The clerk finally looked at her. She studied her face for a moment, the way people study faces when they're trying to decide how much to say and whether saying it will help or only complicate things further. Yes, ma'am, she said. It is. Cassie walked out into the parking lot. The wind hit her immediately, cold and sharp and carrying the smell of pine sap and coming rain. She stood beside her truck for a moment, the manila envelope in one hand, the key they'd given her in the other. It was an old key, heavy, iron, not steel. The kind of key that belonged to a door that meant it when it locked, that had been made to hold something in or keep something out for a very long time. She got in the truck and drove north toward the ridge. The road to Stonehaven was not a road in any modern sense. It was a gravel track barely wide enough for one vehicle, cut into the hillside at an angle that suggested it had been made by a man with a mule and a very long afternoon, and no particular interest in the opinions of anyone who might come after him. The tires of Cassie's Ford crunched over loose stone. The headlights caught the pine trees on either side, their trunks dark and straight, their branches weaving overhead into a canopy that swallowed the last of the pale sky. The storm was building behind her. She could feel it in the pressure behind her eyes, in the way the air had thickened over the past hour, in the way the smell of the mountain had gone from pine and clay to something electrical and anticipating. Thunder moved along the ridge like something enormous pacing in the dark, taking its time, not yet ready to arrive. She drove slowly, not because she was afraid, because she was paying attention. There was a difference. The iron gate at the top of the drive was unlocked. The chain had been looped through the post, but not fastened, just resting there. She stopped the truck, got out, pushed the gate open, drove through, stopped again, closed it behind her. Old habit. You close gates behind you. You leave things the way you found them. Her grandfather had taught her that. He had taught her most things worth knowing. And then she saw the house. Stonehaven Estate sat at the top of a cleared rise, the surrounding trees pulled back from it, as if by an old agreement, as if the pines had been instructed long ago to keep a respectful distance. 3 stories of dark stone, rough cut, fitted together without mortar. In the older sections, the walls thick and deliberately angular, built by someone who understood that in these mountains the weather was not a seasonal inconvenience but a permanent adversary that had to be taken seriously at the foundation level. Narrow windows on the upper floors, deep set in the stone. A wide covered porch along the front, with stone columns that had gone mossy at the base. The roof had a shallow pitch, and copper gutters gone green with age, their patina the color of old money. Ivy had taken the west wall, entirely climbing in thick, deliberate ropes from the foundation to the eaves, but it was controlled ivy. Ivy that had been trained at some point in its history, shaped, given a direction, told where to go and where not to. She stood beside the truck and looked at it for a long time. There was no graffiti, no broken glass, no evidence of squatters, no beer cans or fire rings or spray paint, no kicked-in doors or stripped copper. The windows were intact. The porch railing stood straight. A house this isolated, this long on the county delinquent rolls, sitting empty on 12 acres of ridgeland, with no neighbors close enough to see a light on, should have been stripped by now. Should have had its copper gutters pulled, its windows knocked out by rocks, its doors kicked in by someone looking for shelter from a hard winter or something to sell for $50. None of that had happened. The house looked like it had been set aside, deliberately, not abandoned but preserved, like something placed in a drawer and closed with care and checked on periodically to make sure it was still there. Waiting. Cassie stood in the misting rain and looked at it for a long time. The feeling in her chest had not gone away. It had gotten more specific, more insistent. Then she pulled the iron key from her jacket pocket, walked up the porch steps and approached the front door. It was massive, solid oak, iron handle, hand-forged, the kind of hardware you didn't find in catalogs anymore. No signs of rot at the frame, no swelling, no decay, no darkening from water infiltration. She put the key in the lock and turned it. It clicked easily, smoothly, with the easy precision of a lock that has been regularly maintained, regularly oiled, regularly checked. Not forced, not stuck, just heavy. She pushed the door open. The groan it made was low and slow. Not the shriek of rust and neglect, but something deeper, more deliberate, like the long exhale of a building that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had finally decided to let it go. Inside, the darkness was thick, and the ceilings were high, and the silence was absolute. Cassie clicked on her flashlight and swept it slowly across the foyer. Marble floor gone gray with a thick layer of dust. A chandelier overhead, its crystals filmed with age but not shattered, not stripped, its chains still intact. The walls were plaster, their moldings complexes and intact. A staircase curved upward from the far end of the foyer, wide and winding, its banister made of turned walnut with a particular dark warmth of old hardwood that has never been painted over or stripped. Dust lay on every surface like a quilt, even and undisturbed. But there were no cobwebs, not one. She moved the flashlight beam deliberately into every corner, along every ceiling, juncture, behind every piece of built-in furniture. Nothing. No insects, no rodent droppings along the baseboards, no smell of mildew or rot, or the particular sourness that comes when a building has been wet too many times and dried imperfectly. The air was dry, stale, stone cold, but clean. That was the first thing that didn't fit. An empty house in the West Virginia mountains sitting unoccupied for years should smell like something, should show the evidence of the small lives that move into any warm space when the human occupants leave. The absence of that evidence was not accidental. Cassie moved through the foyer and into the parlor to the left. A marble fireplace occupied most of the near wall, its opening wide enough to stand inside its mantel carved with a pattern of overlapping leaves executed with more skill than you'd expect from a county craftsman in 1919. Beside it, built-in bookshelves empty, but undamaged, their shelves still level. A window facing the drive, its glass intact the night beyond it, dark and wind-shaken. She moved methodically the way she moved through any engine compartment she hadn't worked on before establishing a map, before she started pulling anything apart. The dining room. The kitchen, which had been updated at some point in the early 60s, and not since its appliances heavy and obsolete. A utility room, a back hall with a door to the rear of the property. She came back to the staircase. She ran her hand along the banister as she climbed. The dust was thick here, too evenly distributed, sitting on the surface the way dust sits when it hasn't been disturbed in years. And then 3 steps from the top, her fingers caught on something. An indentation. A seam. She stopped and crouched, angling the flashlight. The seam ran about 8 inches along the inside face of the banister, nearly invisible unless you were touching it, the kind of thing that could sit there for 100 years without anyone noticing, unless they were running their hand along the wood with attention. She pressed against it. Nothing moved. She straightened and kept climbing, filing it away. The second floor had 4 bedrooms, all stripped of furniture, all intact. The third floor had 2 large rooms, whose original purpose she couldn't determine, plus a bathroom with a cast-iron tub and hexagonal tilework, still level and unbroken and grouted cleanly, the work of someone who had done it right the first time and expected it to last. She stood at the top of the house and listened to the storm coming in. Thunder closer now, the intervals tightening. The windows trembled faintly in their frames. She went back downstairs and stood in the center of the foyer with her flashlight off. Let her eyes adjust. Let the house settle around her. She had learned to do this in engine bays in the dark, letting her hearing take over when her eyes got lazy and started missing things. There was a sound, faint, low, coming from the east side of the building. Not the wind, which she knew by now knew its rhythms and its pauses. Not settling wood or stone, which speaks in irregular intervals and has no pattern. This was regular, rhythmic, a mechanical hum barely perceptible but consistent, like the sound of a pump running in a distant basement, cycling through its sequence and doing it again. Cassie turned toward the east hall and walked. The east wing had been closed off. Not with old boards and rusted nails, the kind of improvised barricade you put up in a hurry to keep weather or animals out. The east hall ended in a wall of drywall, smooth and recently patched, the seams taped and mudded with genuine skill. The joints feathered out wide the way professional finishers do when they want the wall to disappear. The paint over it was slightly newer than the paint on the adjacent walls, a shade and a sheen that didn't quite match if you looked at the transition closely. She pressed her palm flat against it and knocked. Hollow. She stepped back and looked at it for a long time. This was not the work of the county. This was the work of someone who had wanted this particular section of the house to look like it had never had a hallway behind it. Someone who had access, who had come in, who had worked carefully and with specific intent. Then she went out to her truck and came back with her pry bar. The drywall gave way faster than she expected. It had been installed to look permanent, not to resist. She pulled the pieces back methodically, stacking them against the opposite wall, working without hurry, without drama. Behind it, beneath a thin film of drywall dust that drifted down as she worked, was a set of double doors. Walnut, dark, rich hand finish to a depth that takes years to develop. Antique brass handles that caught her flashlight beam and threw it back without a trace of tarnish on their surface. She exhaled slowly. She pushed the doors open. The room beyond stopped her at the threshold the way a room sometimes does when it contains something that the person entering it was not expecting and cannot immediately categorize. It was a library, floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall holding hundreds of volumes in leather bindings and cloth covers, their spines embossed in gold that had not dimmed. A narrow iron balcony ran around the upper level, accessed by a small spiral stair in the far corner. Its railing hand-forged into a repeating pattern of overlapping vines that matched the carved leaves on the parlor fireplace. A reading table in the center of the room, solid walnut, its surface clear. Two wingback chairs beside the empty fireplace. And on the floor, covering most of the space between the shelves, a Persian rug in deep burgundy and navy, its pattern intricate and intact. Not a trace of dust on its surface. No footprints, no fading at the high traffic areas near the table and chairs. Not a single crease where a foot might have caught the edge. The rug looked like it had been laid that morning. Cassie stood in the doorway and felt the hair on her arms rise slowly under her jacket. The air in this room was different. Not just cooler, though it was that. Different in a quality she didn't have a precise word for. Controlled. Intentional. As if the room had been maintaining itself, or had been maintained by someone who understood what preservation required. She stepped inside. Her boots sank slightly into the thick pile of the rug. She moved to the bookshelves and ran a finger along one of the spines. No dust transferred to her skin. She checked the surface of the reading table, pressing her palm flat and lifting it. Clean, clean. She stood very still and listened. There it was again, the mechanical hum, close now, directly below her. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the rug, moving it slowly, feeling the boards beneath through the pile. The wood had a different resonance under her hand in the center of the room. She shifted position and pressed again, working outward from that point. There, a change in tone. Hollow in a way the surrounding boards were not. She pulled the rug back in one sharp movement, rolling it toward the wall. A rectangular brass handle was set flush into the floor, embedded in a panel of polished wood that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding boards. The seam was tight and clean, the work of a craftsman who had been thinking about concealment as well as function. No rust on the brass, no discoloration. The metal surface had the faint, warm sheen of something recently touched, recently cleaned, recently considered. Cassie stared at it. Her grandfather had a saying. He was a man who fixed diesel engines for a living, who could diagnose a problem by the sound it made without touching it, who believed that everything mechanical was telling you exactly what it was doing and at every moment if you were patient enough and quiet enough to listen properly. He said the most dangerous things in this world don't make noise. They wait for you to open the damn door. She thought about that saying for about 10 seconds. Then she closed her hand around the handle and pulled. The hatch opened with a hiss, a low pneumatic sound, the exhalation of a pressurized seal releasing after a long time held tight. The air that rose from below was dry and cool, and utterly without the smell of dampness or age, or any of the things that should have been present in a sealed underground space. She clicked her flashlight on, pointed it downward. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. The treads were clean. The walls on either side were fitted stone. She took the first step, then the next. Each tread creaked softly under her weight. The sound echoed off the stone in a way that told her the space below was large, larger than she'd expected for a residential basement. At the bottom, she stopped and swept the flashlight slowly and completely around the room. Rows of metal filing cabinets, floor to ceiling, on 3 walls running the full length of a space that was perhaps 30 feet by 20. Wooden shelving units, holding labeled binders stacked with the precision of someone who filed things to find them again. Cardboard boxes with handwritten labels on their sides, organized by year, the years running from the late 70s forward in a continuous column. A long table in the center, its surface completely clear, waiting, and no dust. Not one speck of mold at the wall junctures, not one scrap of decay on the cardboard boxes. In the far corner, mounted to the stone wall near the ceiling, was the source of the mechanical hum. A ventilation unit, industrial grade, its housing the size of a window air conditioner, but built for permanent installation. Its filter housing had been replaced recently. Recently enough that the replacement filter still had the manufacturer's sticker on its face, the ink on that sticker still sharp and unbleached. A mechanical timer was wired to the unit, its face analog, its clock still running, still cycling the unit through its programmed intervals. Cassie looked at it for a long time. Someone had installed this. Someone had wired the timer, had come back and changed the filter, had maintained the operation of this unit, through seasons and years had kept this space dry and preserved and intact. This was not a forgotten basement. This was a maintained one. The distinction mattered enormously. She walked to the nearest shelving unit and opened the first binder. Property contracts, Harlan County, Copper Falls Township, dated 1976. She opened another. More contracts, 1979, 1981. The same format, the same structure. Transfer of deed, change of ownership. Filed and stamped and certified. She opened a third. 1984. A fourth. 1987. She pulled a box from the nearest stack. Lifted the lid. Newspaper clippings yellowed and folded. Photographs black and white, some Polaroids from the 80s. Envelopes marked confidential. Legal documents on heavy parchment with embossed county seals. She picked up the first document. A land contract dated October 1976. 3 parties listed as sellers, 2 parties listed as buyers. She read down through the dense legal language, the signature lines, the notary stamps. And then she reached the 4th signature on the authorization line. The one that made this transfer official. The one that gave it the weight of the county's authority. Warren Giddens, Mayor Copper Falls Township. She set the document down and picked up another. Warren Giddens, another Warren Giddens. She pulled file after file, box after box, working down the shelving units and then starting on the filing cabinets. Deeds, property records, maps with parcels marked in red ink. Names she didn't recognize crossed out and replaced with company names that had the particular generic emptiness of entities that existed only on paper, names that would dissolve under any serious scrutiny. Same structure on every document. Original owner, transfer, new owner, authorization, Warren Giddens. She found a folder labeled 1983 and opened it. Inside were hand-drawn overlay maps of Copper Falls and the surrounding county, showing land parcels with names written in pencil, several crossed out and rewritten in pen, with different names, different owners. She recognized one name, Pruitt. She'd seen that name on a roadside mailbox driving into town. These were not administrative errors. These were not the innocent mistakes of an overworked county office. This was a system, built deliberately, refined over years, operated with the full authority of the county government and the full intention of the people running it. A mechanism for transferring land from private hands into the hands of shell companies that existed only long enough to resell it. She was still standing at the table with a document in each hand when she heard the footstep above her. A single footstep on the library floor, slow, deliberate. The footstep of someone who knew exactly where they were placing their foot and had placed it there before. She killed the flashlight immediately. The dark closed around her completely. She didn't breathe. Stood absolutely still, her back against the filing cabinets. The documents still in her hands, her ears doing the work her eyes couldn't. Another footstep, moving across the library floor with the same slow deliberation. Then stopping. Silence. She waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The only sound was the quiet, mechanical cycling of the ventilation unit, its steady presence unchanged. Then she heard the soft, precise impact of a small object being set on a hard surface. One sound. Clean, intentional. Then footsteps retreating across the library floor, through the double doors, muffled on the foyer marble. And then nothing. Cassie stood in the dark for another full minute, counting her own pulse. Then she clicked the flashlight back on, climbed the stairs, and came up through the hatch into the library. It was there on the reading table. A key. Brass old, smaller than the iron key that had opened the front door. It had been set down carefully, not thrown, not dropped. Placed with intention in the center of the table on the clear surface. Its surface was clean and warm in the flashlight beam. On its bow, stamped into the metal, was a number. 43. Cassie looked at it. Then she looked at the filing cabinets that lined the far wall of the library, the ones she hadn't examined yet because they ran floor to ceiling and numbered in the dozens. Each one had a small numbered plate on its face. She moved along the row, reading each number until she found it. Cabinet 43, third drawer from the top. The small brass key slid in without resistance, turned without stiffness. She pulled the drawer open. Inside was a single folder thicker than any she had seen in the basement below. No label on the outside. She opened it. The first page was a list of names, not property owners, not county employees. The letterhead on some of the attachments was federal, state seals on others. She read down the list slowly and felt something change in the air around her, the way air changes in the seconds before a lightning strike. A county land commissioner, a state auditor, a federal grant administrator, a senator's deputy chief of staff. Half a dozen names she didn't recognize alongside two or three. She did the kind of names that appeared in newspaper photographs at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and charity dinners, the kind of names that got buildings and parks named after them eventually. All of them connected in one form or another to the transactions documented in the files below. All of them beneficiaries of a machine they had helped run or had agreed to look away from. The machine had not just run locally, it had run upward into offices and institutions that gave it cover and legitimacy and protection. She closed the folder and held it against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. The weight of it was not physical. When she opened them, she looked toward the library windows. Through the narrow gap in the curtains on the nearest window, at the far end of the gravel drive beyond the iron gate, two black SUVs sat with their engines off and their lights dark patient as stones. She did not move for a long time. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she worked. She went back to the basement and she pulled every box from the shelves, every binder, every folder that looked like it had substance. She loaded them into the bed of her Ford, one armload at a time, the storm breaking overhead, now in full rain hammering the gravel drive. Thunder rolling down the ridge in long, continuous waves. She covered the boxes with the canvas tarp from behind the seat, the one she used to protect parts she was carrying, and tied it down with rope, using the knots her grandfather had taught her. By 3 in the morning, she had everything that mattered in the truck. By 4, she had gone back through every room in the house with her flashlight, establishing the layout, completely memorizing the places where the floorboards spoke, and the places where they stayed silent, the angles of the windows, the blind spots, the distances. At 4:30, she sat down on the bare floor of the library with her back against the reading table, knees drawn up the folder from cabinet 43 across her thighs, and let herself think without moving. The SUVs had not moved. She could see the gate at the end of the drive through the front parlor window. They were still there, dark and patient, like they were in no particular hurry because they knew something she didn't about how this would eventually end. She thought about the auctioneer's flat voice. Sold. She thought about the clerk's question. You sure you want it? She thought about the silence in that courthouse room when her hand went up. 7 people who knew, none of them bidding, all of them watching her with that particular stillness that comes from knowing something you have decided not to say out loud. She had bought something. She was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of what. The flashlight beam moved slowly around the library as she thought. The bookshelves, the iron balcony above, the cold, empty fireplace, the double doors she had uncovered from behind the drywall, their brass handles still gleaming in the beam. Someone had built this room to last. Someone had installed that ventilation unit, wired the timer come back, and changed the filters at regular intervals. Someone had kept those documents intact through decades, had gone down that staircase regularly enough that they knew exactly where to step to leave no trace in the library above. Someone had been maintaining this house, not living in it, maintaining it. The difference was significant and deliberate. She was still turning that thought over when her flashlight beam caught the edge of something on the reading table she had walked past twice without registering. Half beneath the spot where the visitor had placed the brass key, the corner of a piece of paper was barely visible at the edge of a leather desk blotter that lay flat on the table. Invisible unless you were standing at exactly this angle with exactly this quality of light. She stood and looked at the paper. It was the corner of an envelope, its paper yellowed to the color of old ivory, its edge beginning to separate from the blotter's edge as she watched. She reached under the blotter and drew it out. The envelope had been sealed, but the glue had dried completely, and the flap came open without resistance. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. She unfolded it beneath the flashlight. It was a list, 33 names, each one followed by a property identification number, a date, and a brief notation. Lost deed, signed under duress, signature forged, evicted without process. The notations were terse, clinical, written in a small, controlled hand that had been trained to record without editorializing. The paper was brittle at the edges, but the ink was still clear throughout. At the top of the list, in a different hand than the notations, was a title. The ones who stayed quiet. Cassie read the list slowly, name after name after name. 33 people who had stayed quiet, who had swallowed what had been done to them, who had decided at some point that silence was the only option that remained to them. 33 stories buried under decades of county paperwork and official indifference, and the particular shame that gets attached to loss when the people doing the losing are made to believe it was their own fault. She turned the page over. The back was blank except for 2 lines written in a different ink and a different hand than anything else on the document. The ink was newer, darker, less faded with age. Someone had come back to this envelope years after it was first placed here and added these 2 lines specifically. It said Helen Marsh. She recorded everything. Cassie read it twice, then a third time. She thought about what it meant that someone had found this envelope, had known what it was and where it was, and had come back to it with new information and new ink. Had needed the person who eventually found this list to know about Helen Marsh and what she had. Had set up a chain of evidence that pointed from this list to a woman in Copper Falls, and from that woman to something that hadn't been found yet. The storm had fully arrived. Rain drove against the stone walls in sheets that sounded like applause. Lightning strobed through the narrow windows in long, sustained pulses. The chandelier in the foyer swung faintly on its chain. Cassie folded the list and put it in the inside pocket of her work jacket close to her chest. She picked up the brass key from where it had been placed on the table. She turned it over in her palm. Cabinet 43. The names that ran upward out of Copper Falls into offices where people made decisions that other people's lives depended on. She looked at the double doors of the library, their brass handles, the iron balcony above, the rug pulled back to expose the closed hatch. She understood something now standing there at 4:45 in the morning, with rain hammering the stone and 2 black SUVs at the end of her driveway and a folder of federal names pressed against her ribs. She understood that she was thinking about it wrong. She had been thinking about Beckett Giddens's visit as a violation, as a trespass on a space that was hers. But she stopped and reconsidered that. How had he gotten in? She had been given the only key at the county clerk's office, had turned it in the lock herself, had heard the bolt retract. No sign of forced entry anywhere. No broken window, no pried door. She walked back to the east wing, back through the double doors, and examined the frame of the door that led out of the library into the east corridor beyond. And there it was. A second lock set into the interior side of the door frame. A deadbolt she had not noticed because she had been pushing the doors open and moving through them without looking at the hardware on the interior side. The keyhole faced into the house. Someone had always had a way in here that had nothing to do with the county clerk's office. A private key, a private entry, a door that only certain people knew existed. That explained how. It did not explain why Beckett Giddens had chosen to use it on this particular night, had chosen to leave the key to Cabinet 43, had chosen to give her access to what that drawer contained without explanation and without asking for anything in return. She thought about that for a long time without reaching a conclusion she was comfortable with. People who had grown up inside a machine like this one, who had watched it operate their entire lives, who had benefited from it even while knowing what it was, did not act out of simple conscience. They acted out of calculation. The question was what calculation Beckett Giddens had made and what he expected to get from it. She didn't have enough information yet to answer that. This house had not been abandoned. It had been waiting. It had been waiting for someone stupid enough or broke enough or stubborn enough or all three to raise their hand for 75 cents while every other person in that courthouse room sat on theirs. Cassie Holt put the key in her jacket pocket, picked up her pry bar from where she had left it against the wall, and went to find Helen Marsh. The town of Copper Falls woke up the same way it had been waking up for 50 years. The Dollar General opened at 7. The diner on Mercer Street started the coffee at 6:45, and the smell of it drifted halfway down the block and sat there in the cold morning air like a small, familiar promise. The single traffic light at the main intersection cycled through its sequence whether anyone was there to see it or not. Dogs barked at the school bus. The Methodist Church marquee still advertised a potluck that had happened 3 weeks ago. Its letters unchanged, its message irrelevant to everyone, except as evidence that nothing in Copper Falls moved very fast. Cassie drove through it slowly on her way out of town, watching the bed of her Ford loaded in tarp behind her. She had driven past the two black SUVs without looking at them directly, the way you drive past a dog that might bite, the way you demonstrate with your body that you are not a threat and are not afraid, even if one of those things is not entirely true. Neither of them moved. Neither of them pulled out behind her. Not immediately. That bothered her more than if they had. She had the address written on a scrap of paper in the cup holder. She had found it the old, in the way you find things in small towns, when you don't want to leave a search history anywhere that can be accessed by someone with the right connections and the wrong intentions. You ask the right kind of question to the right kind of person at the right moment, and you listen carefully to what gets said in the space around the answer. In the hesitations and the qualifications, in the particular way certain names are offered or withheld. Three different people in Copper Falls had mentioned the name Frank Aldridge. In the past week, two of them, without her even asking, both times in the same lowered voice, the same careful sideways phrasing, the way people mention someone they respect and are not entirely sure what to do with that respect. The address led her 40 minutes north, up out of the valley, and along a two-lane state road that ran through second-growth timber country and past abandoned mining equipment, rusting peacefully in overgrown fields, and past houses with American flags and wood piles stacked high and neat against the coming winter. She turned off the state road onto a gravel track and drove another mile through dense pine, the track narrowing as she went, and came out into a clearing. The cabin was small and practical, built by someone who understood the difference between what you need and what you think you need, who had made that distinction clearly and early and stuck to it. Seasoned firewood stacked along the full south wall in a column that went higher than her head, the pieces split and stacked with a precision that spoke of long practice. A satellite dish mounted to the roof with considerably more hardware than the manufacturer specified, as if whoever had installed it had decided once and for all that it was not going to move. A rusted truck in the side yard that had not moved in long enough for grass to grow up through both wheel wells and establish itself. A newer truck parked beside it, clean, ready, backed in, pointing out. The truck of someone who thought about exits. Cassie pulled in and cut the engine. The cabin door opened before she got out. Frank Aldridge stood in the doorway with a coffee cup in one hand and the particular posture of a man who has spent his entire working life standing in doorways, assessing situations, who has never entirely stopped doing it even after the working life ended. He was 68 years old, and he looked at the way men look their age, when they have done physical work for decades with density and weathering rather than frailty and reduction. His face was carved and particular, a face shaped by weather and worry, and the specific kind of patience that comes from having seen what happens when patience runs out. Gray beard, eyes the color of creek water in winter glare, and still and reading her before they were done looking. He didn't speak. Cassie got out of the truck and held up the folder, thick, bulging at the seams. "It's worse than trouble," she said. He looked at the folder for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The kitchen table between them was scarred pine, worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee cups and the accumulated weight of men working through hard problems in the only way available to them, which is slowly and alone. Frank poured her a cup without asking, the cup already in his hand. When she sat down, the reflex of a man who understood that hospitality and information sometimes move together. She set the folder down and opened it and started from the beginning. She told him everything. The auction, the silence in that courthouse room, the drive up in the storm, the intact windows and clean floors, the ventilation unit running on a timer in the basement, the library and the hatch and the filing cabinets, and 3 decades of land contracts with Warren Giddens' signature on every authorization line. The folder in Cabinet 43, and the names that ran upward from Copper Falls into state and federal offices. She told him about Beckett Giddens coming in through the interior lock, placing the brass key on the table without a word and leaving. She told him about the list, the ones who stayed quiet, 33 names, and the 2 lines in fresh ink on the back. She told him about Helen Marsh. Frank listened to all of it without interrupting. He sat with his coffee cup on the table and his hands wrapped around it and his eyes on her face. He was the kind of listener who made you want to be precise, who made imprecision feel like a discourtesy, who listened with enough attention that you could feel it as a kind of pressure to be accurate and complete. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow called twice from the tree line, its voice flat and declarative, and was silent. Frank looked down at his coffee cup. He said, "I know about the files." Cassie waited. He stood up without another word and went to the back of the cabin. She heard a closet door, heard things being moved, heard the particular sound of something being retrieved that had not been touched in a long time. He came back with a shoebox wrapped in fraying twine. He set it on the table and pulled the twine loose and opened the lid. Inside were maps, deed copies, handwritten letters, photographs, notes in a cramped hand on yellow legal pad paper. The paper still yellow, the ink still readable. Documents she recognized immediately, their format identical to what she had found in the basement at Stonehaven. She looked up at him. 30 years, he said. I had half of this 30 years ago. He sat back down. He didn't look at the box, he looked at the table in front of him. In 1994, he said, I was county sheriff. I had been working on land transfers around the Eastern Ridge for about 8 months. I had enough to bring a credible inquiry to the state attorney's office. Not everything you've got, but enough to apply real pressure to the county, enough that people would have had to respond. He paused. Cassie didn't move, didn't prompt him. Let the silence work. Frank picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. My daughter was 7 years old, he said. My wife had just come through a cancer scare that had cost us everything we'd saved, and then some more. We had a mortgage on this property and medical bills that were 6 months past due. I got a call from my supervising lieutenant. He didn't threaten me directly. Men like that rarely do. He told me the inquiry was politically sensitive. He told me to let it sit for now. He told me that my continued employment in the county was contingent on my professional judgment, and that my professional judgment should tell me when to pursue a matter and when to let it rest for the time being. He looked at Cassie for the first time since he had started talking. So I let it rest, he said. The words came out flat and final, the way men say things they have said only to themselves for a very long time in the dark, in the particular way the mind works over something shameful, when there is no one else to say it to. I told myself it was temporary, he said. I told myself I would come back to it when the timing was better. When my daughter was older, when the medical debt was paid, when I had more leverage, when the political situation shifted. I kept the files because some part of me needed to maintain the fiction that I was going to do something with them eventually. He looked at the shoebox. The timing never got better, he said. The right moment never came. I retired in 2004. I moved out here. I kept the files because I couldn't throw them away, and I couldn't throw them away because of what it would mean if I did, what kind of man it would confirm I had become. He looked out the window at the pine trees, at the pale winter light in them. Every year I didn't act, another year passed where that land stayed in the wrong hands. Another year those families stayed without what had been taken from them. And I sat out here with a shoebox wrapped in twine and told myself I was waiting for the right moment. He stopped. The kitchen was very still. There is no right moment, Cassie said quietly. No, he said. There isn't. He reached out and picked up the top document from her folder, looked at the date, looked at the signature, set it back down with the care of someone handling something they understand is going to matter. I'm not the hero of this, he said. I want to be clear about that going in. I'm not looking for a hero, Cassie said. I'm looking for someone who knows the terrain. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the loosening that happens when a man has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and someone else has finally closed their hands around the other end of it. The weight itself doesn't change, but the distribution does. He reached for the coffee pot. First, he said, we get copies. Second, we get them off this property and onto something they can't easily reach. Third, we find the people on that list who are still alive and still have something to say. He refilled her cup. Then we find Helen Marsh, he said. Dale Pruitt's mailbox sat at the end of a rutted gravel drive off Route 9, its red flag up its metal door hanging open on one hinge. Nobody had picked up the mail in a few days. Cassie noticed that. She filed it away without deciding what it meant yet. The farmhouse at the end of the drive had good bones and hard years, the combination that describes most of the buildings in this part of West Virginia. The porch sagged on the left side where the sill beam had settled. The window frames needed painting, the wood going gray at the edges. But the yard was kept, the pasture fencing was maintained, and the barn door was closed and padlocked with hardware that was considerably newer than the barn it was attached to. Cassie had driven out alone. Frank had wanted to come. She had told him no, not yet. She needed to see these people first, without the weight of his history with the county sitting in the room like a third person with its own agenda. She needed them to respond to her, not to a decision a man had made 30 years ago about whether or not to protect them. She knocked. Dale Pruitt answered on the second knock. He was in his mid-50s, compact and hard-worn, with hands that had been doing heavy work for a long time, and the particular wariness around the eyes of a man who has learned through direct experience that unexpected visitors rarely bring anything he's going to be glad about. He looked at Cassie for a moment, then at the folder she was holding. "I don't want whatever you're selling," he said. Cassie opened the folder and held it out at arm's length so he could see the top document without touching it. It was a deed, his property, his father's name on the original line, the transfer date, the signature line. And beside his father's name in pencil in the margin of one of the records she'd found in the Stonehaven basement, two words she had photographed and printed out specifically for this moment: signature forged. Dale Pruitt looked at the document. He didn't speak. His jaw worked once the jaw of a man processing something he has half expected and half dreaded for a long time. "Where did you get that?" he said. It was not a question in any real sense. Cassie told him. He stepped back from the door. She went in. They sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours. He turned the pages of the documents she had brought slowly, without hurrying, with the focus of a man who has been waiting a very long time to understand something and is not going to let impatience get in the way of doing it properly. When he reached the page with his father's name crossed out and replaced by a company name that Cassie had been unable to find in any state business registry, his hand stopped moving. They went flat on this table. "I lost this land in 1992, he said. 30 years ago, I thought I had missed something, signed something I shouldn't have. I went over my copies of those papers 100 times looking for where I had made the mistake." He looked up at her. "They built it so you'd think it was your fault," Cassie said. His face did something complicated then. The kind of thing faces do when a truth that has been pressing against the inside of a person for 30 years finally gets let out, when the pressure equalizes and everything behind it shifts. He went to the back bedroom and came back with a plastic storage bin. Inside were documents he had kept through all those years, his own copies of deeds and correspondence and survey maps, accumulated the way people accumulate evidence when they know something is wrong but lack the framework to name it. His records filled in gaps she hadn't been able to account for. Together, spread across his kitchen table, the two sets told a story considerably more complete than either one had managed alone. Virgil Tatum already knew she was coming. Cassie pulled up to the single-wide trailer at the end of a dead-end road outside Benham and found him already standing in the open door. Dale had called ahead. That meant something. It meant Dale had decided this was real enough to tell someone else about before she even knocked. It meant the chain of trust was already beginning to move on its own. Virgil was 61 years old and had the white hair and the careful stillness of a man who had absorbed more bad surprises than he had any right to be expected to absorb, and had come out the other side not broken but permanently alert, permanently prepared for the next one. He looked at Cassie with the expression of someone who has learned to hold out hope as a discipline rather than a reflex. "If this is about the eviction order," he said, "I already tried twice." Cassie said, "The eviction order doesn't exist in the county records." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He had been told for years that it did. Had been told the records showed a valid court order, that his failure to vacate had been a violation that he had no legal standing to challenge because the documentation was clear and his signature was on the acknowledgement form. He had believed them because he had no particular reason not to, and because the machinery of official process has a specific weight to it, an authority that can make a person doubt their own memory of events they lived through. The order had been fabricated, filed, stamped, certified with the right seals in the right places. And then at some point afterward, the original filing had been removed from the county court records and replaced with a version that bore his signature on a form he had never seen, confirming an understanding he had never had. They had not just taken his house. They had rewritten the sequence of events so that the record showed he had participated in his own removal. That he had agreed, that he had understood. Virgil sat down heavily. He had kept nothing, had thrown everything away in a fury 2 years after it happened, when the last attorney he'd consulted had told him there was nothing to be done, when the last door had closed and staying angry about it was costing more than it was returning. But he remembered everything. Dates, names, faces, the specific details that belonged to experiences that have been examined from every possible angle for years in the privacy of a mind that cannot let them go. Cassie wrote it all down. Helen Marsh's house was on a quiet street in the oldest part of Copper Falls, behind a rusted iron gate that needed lifting, rather than pushing to open the kind of gate that tells you it has been this way for a long time, and the person inside has made peace with it. The lawn was neat. The porch was freshly painted in a careful cream that had been applied recently and evenly. But every window in the house was covered with drawn curtains, front and sides, every single one to edge the house sealed against the outside world with the completeness of something in mourning, or something waiting for a danger that might still come. Cassie had driven past it twice before stopping. Something about the curtains, the particular totality of them. The house of a woman who had decided at some point that she was done looking out. She knocked once, then again. A long silence. The kind of silence that tells you someone is on the other side of it. Then who's asking? The voice came through the door itself, which meant the woman inside had moved close enough to speak through it without opening it, which meant she had a protocol for this, had thought about it, had decided on her response to unexpected knocking at some point, and implemented it. "My name is Cassie Holt," Cassie said. "I live out at Stonehaven now." A pause. "I think you might know what that means." The silence on the other side stretched for a full 5 seconds. Cassie counted them. Then the lock turned. Helen Marsh was 73 years old and had the physical economy of a woman who had survived things by making herself small and still, and very, very careful about where she put her trust. She was barely 5 feet tall, dressed in a housecoat and slippers at 10 in the morning, because this was her house and she had stopped caring what that looked like to visitors, most of whom she didn't invite. Her hair was white and pulled back with the precision of someone who still believed in precision. Her eyes were dark and quick and missed nothing they looked at. She smoked. The cigarette burning low between 2 fingers when she opened the door told Cassie this was a house where cigarettes burned at 10 in the morning as a matter of course, as part of the structure of a day that had been arranged around certain specific consolations. They sat at her kitchen table. Everything in the room had a place and was in it, the counters, spotless, the drawers labeled in a small, neat hand, the dish rack empty and dry, the window above the sink covered with the same drawn curtain as all the others. The order of a woman who controlled what she could because the world had taught her the limits of that control, and she had responded by being impeccable within them. Helen lit a second cigarette off the end of the first. "I told myself I would never talk about it again," she said. "Not after what happened to the others." She said 2 names. Said them quietly the way you say the names of people who are gone, with the particular softness reserved for the ones whose going cannot be separated from the thing you're trying to discuss. Betty, Marvin. Cassie didn't know them. Helen could see that in her face. "Of course not," she said. "That's the point." She looked at the window, at the curtain. "They brought me documents to file," she said. "I was a clerk at the county assessor's office from 1978 to 1987. Routine work, most of it genuinely routine. But in 1983, a batch of transfer documents came through, and something about the signatures didn't sit correctly. The acknowledgement stamps were from a notary I knew personally, who I knew had retired the year before, whose stamp should not have been in active use. She drew on her cigarette. I flagged it. Asked questions. The following week, I was called into a meeting. Warren Giddens was present. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat in any language that could be written down or reported. He simply explained very quietly that I had a future at the county if I understood my role, and that my role was to process what came across my desk, not to audit it. He told me that asking questions about documents I wasn't responsible for authorizing was a procedural violation that could result in my termination and potentially more serious consequences, depending on what I might be seen to be implying. She stubbed out the cigarette with a sharp, decisive twist that spoke of a memory she had made peace with, but not forgotten. "I backed off," she said. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Notes started appearing. Under her door at home, once on the windshield of her car in the county parking lot. Not threatening in their explicit language, but carrying a full message in what they implied in the gap between the words and what it meant that someone had gotten close enough to leave them. She had kept everyone, had kept them because she had understood even at the time that evidence needs witnesses, and the only witness she could reliably count on was paper. And then she had started recording. She had a portable cassette recorder she had bought at the Kmart in Harlan, paying cash on a weekday afternoon when she had told herself she was going to the pharmacy. She had carried it to work in her purse and she had left it running in her desk drawer on the days when she knew certain people were coming in. She had recorded conversations in the hallway she could hear through her office door. She had recorded 3 meetings she was asked to attend where specific documents were discussed and where she was told afterward with a calmness she found more frightening than anger would have been that she had not attended any such meetings. She had done this for 4 years. Until 1987, when she was told her position was being eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring, and she was offered a settlement that she accepted because she had a sister in Harlem she was responsible for, and no other options she could see clearly at the time. "You have the tapes," Cassie said. Helen Marsh looked at her with the expression of a woman who has waited a very long time to be asked the right question. Then she stood up and said, "Follow me." The attic was low and slant-ceilinged and smelled of old insulation and cardboard boxes that had been up there long enough to have become part of the smell of the house. Helen climbed the pull-down stairs without hesitation, navigating the space with the ease of someone who came here regularly, who knew which boards took weight and which ones complained. She went to the far wall, moved a stack of labeled document boxes aside with practiced efficiency, and pressed her palm flat against the drywall at the back wall. A section of it swung inward on a pair of cabinet hinges. Behind it was a space about the size of a large closet. Inside that space, bolted to the floor through an eye hook with a padlock chain, sat a heavy metal lockbox, dented and surface rusted, but solid in its structure. The kind of lockbox that gets dented because it has been moved many times and stored under other things. Helen produced the key from the pocket of her housecoat. The padlock opened. Inside the lockbox were cassette tapes in labeled plastic cases, each label handwritten in the small, precise hand Cassie had seen in Helen's kitchen. Folders stuffed with documents, their edges brown with age but their contents readable. A portable cassette recorder, its batteries long dead, its tape head still clean, the machine of someone who had maintained her equipment. And pages, dozens of pages of official county forms and memos and transfer documents, some of them marked with handwritten annotations in red ballpoint ink. Replace name, back date, signature, seal without initial. Instructions written directly on the documents themselves in the handwriting of someone explaining a process to someone else who was going to be performing it. Instructions for how to falsify each specific element, which field to change, what date to write, and whose seal to press without adding the required initial. The casual specificity of it was the worst part. This was not panic or improvisation. This was a job description for a role in a functioning operation. Cassie picked up one of the cassette cases and turned it over. The label on the front was dated October 1984. The handwriting was small and precise and had been placed on the label with care. She looked at Helen. Helen stood with her arms crossed and her chin slightly up, the posture of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to be believed and has not quite allowed herself to expect it even now. "They told me to bury the truth," Helen said. She looked at the lockbox. "But secrets don't rot. They wait." Nora Sloan arrived in Copper Falls on a Thursday morning in a car that suited her the way work clothes suit people who actually work in them. A dark green Subaru wagon with a dented rear quarter panel and a university parking sticker in the back window. The kind of car that is invisible in 3/4 of the country and perfectly calibrated for going to places where drawing attention is a liability. She was in her early 40s, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with the specific quality of alertness that belongs to people whose professional survival has depended on noticing precisely what most other people overlook. She walked into Frank's kitchen, set her bag on the table, and looked at the documents spread across it for about 30 seconds without speaking. She said, "How deep does it go?" Cassie said. "Deeper than we can see yet." Nora pulled out a digital recorder and placed it in the center of the table. She said, then we start at the top and work down. They spent 2 days going through everything, the two of them and Frank, working in shifts with Frank, making coffee that got progressively stronger as the nights got later. Nora was methodical in a way that Cassie recognized as a different kind of mechanical skill, the same underlying discipline expressed in a different domain. She cross-referenced documents the way Cassie cross-referenced part numbers, building a map of connections, marking where the chain of evidence was solid and where it had gaps that needed filling, identifying what could stand alone and what needed corroboration. On the second night, she played the cassette tapes. The recordings were old, and the quality was what you'd expect from a cassette player, inside a desk drawer, muffled and ambient, with the occasional intrusion of shuffling papers or a distant hallway door. But the voices were audible and clear enough. Helen's recorder had been a good one for its era, and she had used it with more patience and discipline than most trained journalists would have managed in her position. Warren Giddens' voice came through without ambiguity. His diction was clear and practiced the voice of a man who had spent decades speaking in official rooms with the assumption that his words carried weight and his authority was unquestioned. They listened to 3 tapes in full without stopping. On the 4th tape, 15 minutes into the recording, a second voice entered. Not Warren, older in register, slower in its cadence, carrying the West Virginia inflection that Warren's had been smoothed away from by education and office. Cassie had not heard this voice before. Frank had. He sat perfectly still across the table from her when the voice came through the speaker. The particular stillness of a man hearing something confirmed that he had suspected for a long time and had managed through effort to half disbelieve. Nora looked at him. "Who is that?" she said. Frank said the name. Cassie didn't know it. Nora did. She sat back in her chair and looked at the recorder for a moment before she spoke. The man on the tape was a retired circuit court judge who had spent 40 years in the legal community of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. He had endowed a scholarship at the regional high school that bore his name on the letterhead. He had a building in Harlan named after him, a county services building, where ordinary people went to pay their taxes and register their vehicles. His name on a plaque by the entrance in letters that would last another 50 years. He was the kind of figure that small communities need to believe in, proof that not everything turns bad, that some men stay honest, that a life can be spent in service without being corrupted by the proximity to power. The tape did not support this. Nora looked at Frank. "Is he still in Copper Falls?" "He lives on Birch Creek Road," Frank said. 12 minutes from where we're sitting." They were quiet for a moment, the 3 of them, with the recorder still running and the old voice still coming from the speaker, calm and certain and completely unaware of what the cassette in Helen Marsh's purse was recording. Then Nora's phone buzzed. She looked at it, looked at Cassie. "He knows," she said. "Someone told him we have the tapes. He's already called twice. He wants to meet." He called it a conversation. He chose the location, a diner on the county line he had evidently used for this purpose, before a booth in the back with good sight lines and low ambient noise and the kind of anonymity that comes from a place where the regular customers are focused entirely on their own situations. He was already seated when Cassie arrived, his hands folded on the table, his expression, the composed and measured expression of a man who has spent 40 years being the most reasonable person in difficult rooms and has never entirely come down from that. He didn't deny the tape. He reframed it. Context, he said. Different times. Decisions made under different pressures with different information available. The complexities of county development in the 1980s, when the options were not always what they appeared from the outside, when certain accommodations were made in service of larger goals that were ultimately beneficial to the community. None of which excused what happened. He was the first to acknowledge that. He slid an envelope across the table. He called it a contribution to her restoration efforts at Stonehaven Estate. He said it without emphasis, without urgency, just placed it on the table between them and left it there. The gesture of a man who has made this gesture before in other contexts and has learned the exact tone in which to make it seem reasonable. Cassie looked at the envelope on the table. She did not touch it. She looked at him. At the hands folded on the table. At the face that had spent decades looking like the face of someone you could trust. He held her gaze with the patience of a man who had done this before and expected it to go the way these things always went, who understood the moment that preceded the reaching of a hand because he had watched it many times from the other side of the table. The moment stretched, extended past the point where it should have resolved, extended past the point where his patience was designed to hold. Cassie stood up. She left the envelope on the table. She walked out of the diner into the cold air. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of the envelope being picked back up. It was the sound of a man who had decided that since this hadn't worked, he would need to try something else. She filed the sound away and kept walking. The night they cut her power, she was in the library at Stonehaven with a stack of eviction notices from the late 80s, working through them under the portable work light she had set up on the reading table. She had brought in a generator and run extension cords to the room she was using. She had reinforced the east wing doors with additional hardware and had placed wireless cameras at both entrances. With Nora's help, the footage streaming to a server Nora controlled in a location she hadn't specified. The lights went out at 11:43. Not a flicker, not a gradual fade. A cut. Total and immediate, as if someone had thrown a master switch. She already had her hand flashlight. She moved through the house, slowly sweeping the beam, checking each room in the sequence she had established. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. She went to the utility room and put her flashlight on the breaker panel. The cover was standing open. The wires inside had been cleanly severed, not yanked or chewed through, but cut with something sharp and precise, the cut straight and deliberate. The work of someone who knew what they were doing and had taken the time to do it properly. Scratched into the metal face of the panel by something with a narrow point were three words: "You were warned." She stood there with the flashlight on those words for a long time. She felt the anger rise in her, clean and clarifying the way heat rises from an engine running under load, burning off everything that isn't essential. Not fear, something harder and more useful than fear. Something that didn't make your hands shake. She worked through the rest of the house, methodically checking every window latch, every exterior door, the camera feeds on her phone, all still transmitting from battery backup. When she reached the front door and opened it to check the exterior camera mounted above the frame, she found it, taped to the inside surface of the storm door. A photograph, printed on standard paper, slightly grainy, taken from outside the library window through the narrow gap in the curtains. Black and white. It showed her standing at the open hatch in the library floor, looking down, the exact posture and position of the moment she had first pulled it open on her first night in the house. Someone had been outside that window in the dark with a camera with a long enough lens and had taken this photograph and had waited for the right moment to leave it where she would find it. Not in the mailbox, not under the door. Taped to the inside of the storm door, which meant they had been on the porch, which meant they had been close. The photograph did not have a message written on it. It didn't need one. The message was entirely in the fact of it. She took it down carefully, holding it by one edge, and went back inside and bolted the door. She stood in the foyer for a moment, looking at the photograph in the beam of her flashlight. Then she went back to the library, sat down at the reading table, and called Nora. 2 days later, in a back booth at a truck stop diner on Route 81, Nora laid the hard drive on the table between them. "It's all in place," Nora said. 3 off-site backups on separate servers, encrypted, video proof from the cameras, 38 sworn statements, 22 verified property conflicts with documentary evidence, 9 active officials with documented connections to the transfer network, audio from Helen's tapes with both voices confirmed. She looked at Cassie across the table. "We go public Friday," she said. Cassie looked at the hard drive. Everything that had been in those filing cabinets in Frank's shoebox in Helen's attic, behind the false wall on those cassette tapes, everything Dale Pruitt and Virgil Tatum had held onto through decades in plastic bins and back closet boxes, all of it reduced to an object the size of a thumb sitting on a truck stop table between 2 cups of bad coffee. Nora leaned forward. "I've covered dirty police unions," she said. "I've covered fake cancer charities and municipal fraud that went to the State House. But this she touched, the drive, this is 40 years. This is institutional. This is every level of the system pointing at the same address." She paused. "Once this goes live, your name is on it. There is no version where you remain anonymous." Cassie picked up her coffee cup. "I didn't come this far to whisper," she said. "They found Archive Room C on a Wednesday night. Cassie had been moving through the west wing for the third time. The servants' corridor that ran along the back of the house, narrower than the main hall's, lower ceilinged, its floorboards a different width. She had pulled the boarding off the windows to let her flashlight work along the baseboards, checking for anything she had missed in the previous passes. Frank was with her. He moved through spaces methodically, the way men who have spent careers reading scenes move through them, touching surfaces, noting inconsistencies, working in a pattern that covered the space without redundancy. He was the one who found it. Behind a section of the corridor wall below a decorative recessed panel that looked structural, but sounded wrong when he pressed it hollow rather than solid, there was a seam. He found it with his knuckle on the second pass, the way seams in old construction are found by feel and by sound rather than sight. They worked the panel loose together. Behind it was a narrow spiral staircase, stone steps rather than wood, descending into a darkness that was colder than the rest of the basement, a different quality of cold, the cold of a deeper space. They went down. The staircase opened into a corridor that ran at an angle away from the main building below and beyond the footprint of the house above, following a line that seemed to track toward the ridge rather than back toward the foundation. At the end of the corridor was a steel door, heavy gauge surface, rusted but solid at its core. Set into the face of the door was a mechanical lock, and below it, partially obscured by the rust that had been encouraged to grow over it, an engraving. Archive Room C, restricted. Frank found the latch on the second examination of the doorframe. He twisted it and put his shoulder against the steel, and it opened with a slow grinding resistance and then a release. A long hiss of pressurized air, the same sound as the hatch above, but slower and heavier, the release of a space that had been more tightly sealed for longer. The air inside was cold and close, and had the particular quality of a space that has been sealed for years, not merely unvisited, but genuinely closed off from the movement of the larger world. Their headlamp beams swept across the room in unison. Filing cabinets floor to ceiling, running the length of a room, perhaps 40 feet by 20. Shelving units holding video reels in labeled metal canisters, 3 rows of them. Cassettes, tape cases different from Helen's, these labeled and organized in chronological columns. 3 ring binders, dozens of them, their spines labeled in the same controlled handwriting she had seen in the basement above. Cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape that had dried and was beginning to separate at the corners. Everything labeled. Everything dated. The archive of someone who had been absolutely certain this material needed to survive and had taken every measure available to ensure it. And in the center of the room, a long wooden table. Clean, clear, waiting. Cassie walked to the nearest filing cabinet and pulled the first drawer. Meeting transcripts. Dozens of them bound in paper clips dated in sequence. The earliest was 1976. The most recent was 2013. She opened one from 1986. The meeting had been held at Stonehaven Estate. The address was in the header. The attendees were listed Warren Giddens. 3 other names she recognized from the documents above, and 2 names she recognized from the folder in cabinet 43. She pulled another drawer. Financial ledgers, columns of figures initialed at the bottom of each page. Donation records, disbursement logs, the financial infrastructure of the operation, the money that had moved alongside the land, funding the careers and campaigns that had provided cover and protection for 4 decades. She opened a third drawer, video reels in their canisters labeled by year and meeting number. She counted 19 of them. Beside them, in a separate smaller section of the drawer, an object she had not expected. A bound notebook, leather-covered, dark brown. Its surface cracked and dry with age, but intact, the binding still holding, the covers still protecting whatever was inside. She picked it up. It was heavy. She opened it to the first page and stopped. Frank was beside her. He looked at what she was holding. His jaw tightened. The handwriting on the first page was small and controlled the script of someone who had been educated in a time when handwriting was taught with rigor and taken seriously. The entries were precise and without sentiment, the record of someone who kept records not out of guilt, but out of the same professional instinct that makes certain kinds of men document everything, who understood that the record was its own kind of power. The first entry was dated 1967, not 1976, not the year the records in the main basement began. 9 years earlier, the machine had not started with Warren Giddens. It had started with his father. Cassie stood in Archive Room C with the leather notebook in her hands and the cold pressing in from the stone walls, and the weight of what she was holding, settling into her bones the way deep cold settles slowly reaching toward the center. Frank stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. Above them, Stonehaven was quiet. The house that had been preserving all of this, maintaining it through decades, waiting for the person who would carry it out into the light, was still impatient. Friday was 2 days away. The notebook took all night to read. Cassie sat on the stone floor of Archive Room C, with her back against the filing cabinets, and her headlamp angled over the pages, and she read every word. Frank sat across from her and read the photocopies she passed to him as she finished each section. Neither of them speaking, the cold pressing in from the walls, the silence of the space, complete and total, in the way only underground silence can be absolute, and without the ambient texture of the world above. The first entry was dated March 1967. The handwriting belonged to a man named Edward Giddens, Warren's father, a man who had died in 1989 and been memorialized with a brass plaque on the wall of the Copper Falls Town Hall that Cassie had walked past a dozen times without ever stopping to read the inscription. The entries were precise and without sentiment. Dates, names, property identification numbers, meeting locations, figures. The kind of record a man keeps not out of guilt, but out of the same instinct that makes accountants double-check their columns. The professional need to verify that the machine is running correctly, that every moving part is accounted for, that nothing has been missed. Edward Giddens had begun the machine in 1967 with a single property on the Eastern Ridge, a stone house on 12 acres built in 1919, owned by a family named Storrow. The entry was 4 lines long. It described the mechanism of transfer in the same terse procedural language used for every entry that followed. Meeting held, terms established, documents prepared, transfer executed. The Storrow family did not appear in the notebook again after that first entry. They had simply been removed from the record the way you remove a line from a ledger when the account is closed. The house they had built, the land they had cleared and farmed and passed from one generation to the next, became in 4 lines of careful handwriting the property of Harlan County, and then through a sequence of transfers executed over the 3 years following the private holding of the Giddens Family Trust. The house they had built was Stonehaven. Cassie held the notebook and looked at the date of that first entry, 1967, 57 years ago. Before Warren Giddens had held any office, before any of the documents in the main basement had been filed, before any of the people on Helen's cassette tapes had been in their positions or their careers had intersected with any of this. The machine had not started as a system. It had started as a theft. One house, one family. One decision made by a man who understood that if you controlled the paperwork, you controlled the memory, and if you controlled the memory, you controlled the truth. Warren had not built the machine. He had inherited it, had grown up inside it, had refined it and scaled it and run it for 4 decades with the smooth efficiency of a man who had watched it operate his entire life and had never once considered that it was not his to run. Frank looked up from the pages in his hands. His face in the headlamp light was stone still. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. They were both looking at the same thing. Cassie closed the notebook. She thought about the Storrow family, about what it meant to cut stone from the ridge yourself, to fit it together without mortar, to hang the iron balcony railing, and lay the hexagonal tile in the upstairs bathroom, and train the ivy on the west wall, and then to have all of it removed from you in 4 lines of handwriting in a notebook kept in a sealed room under the house itself. To not know it had been written down, to not know that the man who had taken everything had been careful enough to document it. She thought about what it meant that somewhere in Copper Falls or close to it, a woman named Edna Storrow was going about her ordinary life without knowing any of this. She put the notebook in the bag with the rest of the materials they were removing. Then she and Frank climbed back up the spiral staircase and through the false panel in the corridor wall, and the house was dark and still above them, and outside the first faint suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the ridgeline from the sky. Friday was 12 hours away. The article ran at 6:02 in the morning. Cassie was standing at the library window with a cup of coffee when her phone started vibrating continuously on the reading table. She looked at the screen. Nora, then Dale Pruitt, then a number she didn't recognize, then 2 more, then Frank. She set the coffee down and called Nora. Before she could speak, Nora said, "It's running everywhere. Chronicle has the front page." AP picked it up at 6:15. "Both networks are pulling from the wire. Check the gate." Cassie moved to the parlor window. The iron gate at the bottom of the gravel road was visible in the early light. Beyond it, at the edge of the county road, 3 vehicles had already stopped. She could see the dish on the roof of the nearest one. Channel 9. Behind those, more headlights coming up the ridge road. Nora's voice, "State Commission investigator, called my editor at 6:20. They want chain of custody on the originals. Don't let anyone in until Patricia is with you." Patricia Crane picked up on the first ring. She had been awake. She had already read the article. She was 20 minutes away. At 8:40, Cassie's phone rang once from an unknown number. She answered because she had been answering unknown numbers all morning, because there were a lot of numbers she didn't have yet. The voice on the other end was older than she expected. Slower. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life in rooms where he was the last one to speak and had come to believe that was the natural order of things. He didn't identify himself. He didn't need to. He said, "I want you to know I built something here." Cassie said nothing. He said, "Whatever they say I did, I built this town. I brought investment in when no one else would come near this place. I kept the lights on for 30 years. Cassie said, "You built it on other people's land. There's a difference between building and building on top of something." The line was quiet for a moment. Then it went dead. That was the only time Warren Giddens ever spoke to her directly. By 6:40, the gravel drive held 2 black government SUVs, a state commission vehicle, a Channel 9 news van, and 2 Harlan County Sheriff cruisers. Their lights ran in the morning dark. Their doors opened and closed, and people stood in the cold looking up at the house. The SUVs, Cassie noted, matched the ones Nora had identified from the security footage, both registered to a private contractor out of Lexington that held a county emergency services retainer signed by Warren Giddens, renewed annually since 2009. She had received that information from Nora at 6:30 with a single line of text beneath it. Not government, private. They were watching for him. She unlocked the front door and walked out onto the porch. The woman in the slate gray suit was named Hallman, State Commission investigator, and she stood at the foot of the porch steps with a younger man beside her, and she looked up at Cassie with the expression of a professional who had seen enough of these mornings to have stopped expecting any of them to be routine. Cassie had looked her up the night before, found nothing irregular, called Nora at midnight and asked her to run the name through channels Cassie didn't have access to. Nora had called back at 12:40. "She's clean. As far as I can find, she's actually clean. Take that carefully, but take it." She let Hallman and her partner in. She kept the news van outside the gate. Patricia Crane arrived at 7:15 and positioned herself between Cassie and every question that came from an angle she hadn't approved. Hallman's partner, a quieter man named Barrett, was on his second box of documents when he stopped turning pages and sat back. He said quietly to no one in particular, "This isn't just civil." He looked at Hallman. "This is federal," he said. Cassie kept her face neutral. Crane touched her arm once lightly, the signal they had agreed on. "You'll need a bigger van," Cassie said. Barrett looked at her, then at the boxes along the wall, then at the hallway. He said, "How much more is there?" Cassie thought about Archive Room C, the filing cabinets floor to ceiling, the video reels, the financial ledgers, the leather notebook with its first entry dated 1967. She said enough. Warren Giddens had not been seen publicly since the previous evening. His office issued a statement at 9 through a law firm in Lexington. The statement used the phrase "administrative irregularities" 4 times, isolated clerical errors twice, and the name of a retired notary who had died in 2019 3 times. It did not use the word fraud. It did not acknowledge the recordings. It did not address the financial ledgers, the meeting transcripts, the video reels, or the leather notebook. Nora sent the statement to Cassie at 9:15 with a single line beneath it. "They're going to try to blame a dead woman. Don't let them." Cassie read the statement once, set her phone face down on the reading table. By noon, Patricia Crane had filed the response that cut the narrative off before it could establish itself. A precise legal document that cross-referenced every claim in the statement against specific records in the archive, point by point, date by date, showing with documentary precision that the notary whose name appeared in the statement had not held an active commission, During the years her stamps appeared on the documents, that the transfers were not isolated, that the pattern was systemic and documented and spanning 47 years. The law firm in Lexington went quiet after that. By 3 in the afternoon, a federal prosecutor's office had opened a preliminary inquiry. By 5, 2 of the names from Cabinet 43 had retained individual attorneys. By 6, one of those attorneys had called Patricia Crane to discuss the possibility of cooperation. The machine was not collapsing. Machines don't collapse all at once. They seize, they lock up. They stop turning because one gear has finally caught on something it cannot push past, and all the force in the system presses against that one point of resistance until the whole apparatus shudders and stalls. Cassie sat on the porch of Stonehaven in the early dark and listened to phone calls coming and going through the house behind her and thought about gears. The preliminary hearing was held on a Tuesday in the courthouse in Harlan, a building that took its own gravity, seriously high ceilings and oak paneling, and the particular weight of rooms where consequential things have been decided for a long time, and the walls have absorbed all of it. It was packed in the way that courthouses are rarely packed, every bench full, people standing along the walls, cameras in the designated positions, reporters in the gallery with notebooks already open. Warren Giddens was not present. His attorneys had cited medical necessity. His absence sat in the room like its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who understood the room and had decided that the room was not ready for him yet. Beckett Giddens was present. He sat at a separate table to the left of the defense position, his own attorney beside him, separate from his father's legal team, in a way that was itself a message. He was in his mid-30s and looked like several consecutive nights without sufficient sleep, wearing a suit that fit well, and an expression that did not fit him at all, the expression of a man who has made a decision he was certain of, and is discovering in the specific way certainty is always discovered, that being certain was only the beginning. Cassie looked at him when she entered. He looked back. Neither of them spoke. She thought about the brass key on the marble table. The single act of a man who had known for a long time what his father was, who had lived inside that knowledge for years, who had found the only way available to him to act on it that didn't require him to be something he wasn't. Not a hero, not even close. A man who had, in the only way available to him, quietly chosen a side. She took her seat. The judge entered. The room stood. The room sat. The prosecution opened with precision and force. The documentary record, the chain of custody, the audio recordings entered into evidence, their voices identified. The video reels from Archive Room C, 3 of them, successfully transferred to digital format. In the preceding week, their content showing meetings held inside the very rooms of Stonehaven that Cassie had walked through on her first night in the house, showing Warren Giddens and others at a table discussing specific transfers with the casual thoroughness of men who had done this many times before and expected to do it many times more. The defense moved to suppress the Archive Room C materials on grounds of unlawful access to a restricted space. Patricia Crane responded with the deed of sale and the county auction record. Stonehaven Estate sold to Cassie Holt, including everything within its legal boundary, including any room within that boundary, restricted or otherwise as of the date of sale. The judge considered this for approximately 90 seconds. She said, "Motion denied." Continue. Then the judge called Cassie to the stand. She walked to the witness chair and sat and looked at the room. Dozens of faces looking back. Dale Pruitt in the fourth row, arms crossed, jaw set. Virgil Tatum beside him, upright, watchful. Frank Aldridge near the aisle, his hands folded on his knees. Helen Marsh in the second row, small and straight, her hands in her lap. And in the back row near the door, a woman Cassie had not seen before. Silver-haired, slight, 67 perhaps, dressed in the careful way of someone who had thought about what they were wearing. For a day, they understood to be significant without knowing exactly why. She had arrived and taken the last seat in the gallery and had been sitting with her hands folded and her attention complete since the proceedings began. She looked at the room and at the documents and at the walls with a focus that was different from all the other focuses in the room. She looked like a person trying to recognize something. Cassie looked away from her and at the judge. "State your name and your connection to the matter." Cassie said, "My name is Cassie Holt. I purchased Stonehaven Estate 8 months ago through a county delinquent tax auction for 75 cents. She paused. "What I found inside it was not what the county records described," she said. "The county records described a delinquent property. What I found was a 40-year archive of organized land theft. And beneath that, in a room that wasn't on any blueprint evidence that the theft did not begin 40 years ago. It began with the house itself. She spoke for 18 minutes. No notes, no pauses to recall. The events had been inside her for months, turning over in the particular way that things turn when you are living inside them rather than looking at them from the outside. They came out in order and in full without drama, with the flat precision of someone describing the failure of a system they have diagnosed completely. She described the auction and the silence in the courthouse room, the house, its impossible cleanliness, the ventilation unit on its timer, the library and the hatch and the basement and what she found there, the folder in cabinet 43, the two black SUVs at the end of the drive, later identified as belonging to a private contractor on the county payroll, the key that Beckett Giddens had left on the table without a word, the list in the 2 lines in fresh ink on its back. She described the cut wires in the photograph of herself standing over the hatch in the 3 words scratched into the breaker panel. She described archive room C, the spiral stairs, the steel door, the filing cabinets, in the video reels, in the financial ledgers, in the leather notebook. She said the first entry in that notebook is dated March 1967. It describes the transfer of a stone house on 12 acres built in 1919 by a family named Storrow into the hands of the county and then into the Giddens Family Trust. The Storrow family built Stonehaven. They lived in it for 48 years. Then Edward Giddens put pen to paper and erased them. That was 1967. Warren Giddens didn't start filing his version of the record until 1976. The machine was already 9 years old before the first document in that basement was ever stamped. This was not Warren Giddens' invention. It was his inheritance. He took what his father built and ran it for 4 decades and never once considered that it would be required to stop. The room was absolutely quiet. This was not a system of ignorance, she said. It was a system of erasure, and Stonehaven remembered every piece of it that they hoped we would forget. She stepped down. Helen Marsh walked to the stand slowly and without assistance. She sat. She adjusted the microphone with the precision of someone who has spent years operating audio equipment and knows what good placement sounds like. She placed a small notebook on the ledge in front of her, open to her entries. She read from it for 11 minutes. She described the documents she had been asked to file in 1983 and what had been wrong with them. She described the meeting with Warren Giddens, the room that shared the exact phrasing of what he had said. She described the notes under her door. She described the decision she had made to begin recording the cassette recorder from the Kmartis in Harlan, the purse it traveled in the desk drawer it sat in. Her voice was unsteady at first. The tremor of age and the tremor of something held tightly for 40 years, releasing at the same time, occupying the same register, indistinguishable from each other. But she did not stop. The steadiness came gradually, the way it comes to people who are doing the thing they have been afraid to do for so long that the doing of it turns out to be less terrible than the fearing of it had been. When she finished, the judge sat without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh. You may step down." Helen gathered her notebook, straightened it, and walked back to her seat. Dale Pruitt wore clean clothes, his best, a flannel shirt pressed with the precision of a man who had ironed his own shirts his entire life and considered it a serious responsibility. He walked to the stand without hurrying. The attorney asked him to describe his experience of the property transfer in 1992. He said, "I lost that land in 1992. For 30 years, I believed it was something I had done wrong, something I had missed or failed to read or failed to understand. I went through those papers hundreds of times trying to find where I had made the mistake." He paused. He said, "They built it that way. They built it so you would blame yourself. So the man who lost his land would spend the rest of his life believing it was his own fault. That's not just theft. That's something worse than theft. That's taking a man's past and making him ashamed of it." He looked at the defense table for a moment. Then he looked away. He said, "She gave it back. Not the land, not yet, but the truth of what happened. And that matters more than I expected it to." He stepped down. Frank Aldridge walked to the stand with the deliberate pace of a man who has made a decision and is carrying the weight of it evenly and without complaint. He sat. He looked at the judge. He did not look at his hands. The attorney asked him to describe his investigation in 1994. Frank said, "I was Harlan County Sheriff from 1990 to 2004. In 1994, I had conducted an 8-month investigation into land transfers in the Eastern Ridge District. I had sufficient documentation to bring a credible inquiry to the state attorney's office." He stopped. "I did not bring it," he said. "I was advised by my supervising lieutenant to discontinue the inquiry on grounds of political sensitivity, and I accepted that advisement. I accepted it because I had a family and a mortgage and medical debt, and I was afraid of what refusing would cost me." He looked at the room. "I kept the files," he said. "I told myself I would return to the matter when conditions were better. Conditions did not get better. I retired. I moved away. I carried those files for 30 years without doing anything with them, because doing something with them required a kind of courage I had decided I could not afford." He looked at Cassie. His expression was the expression of a man who has come to the end of a very long reckoning with himself. "I was wrong about what I could afford," he said. "The cost of doing nothing turned out to be higher than the cost of doing something. I just didn't pay it myself. Other people paid it for me, year after year, family after family. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. I cannot undo it. I can only stand here and say it plainly and let the record reflect that I knew. And I stopped, and I was wrong to stop." The room held that. The judge looked at Frank for a long moment before she turned the page and moved to the next order of business. The hearing recessed at 4:30. Cassie walked out of the courthouse and into the cold afternoon and stood on the steps and let the air hit her face. The crowd beyond the steps was larger than it had been in the morning. People she recognized from Copper Falls, people she didn't recognize from counties she'd never been to, some holding signs, others standing still, some looking at her with expressions she didn't know what to do with. She stood there for a moment, not performing composure, just standing, letting the day settle. Then a hand touched her arm. She turned. The woman from the back row, silver-haired, slight in her careful clothes. Up close, she had the kind of face that shows its specific history, not beautiful in any general sense, but deeply particular, the face of someone whose life had happened to them in a specific place and had left that place's marks. She was holding a folded piece of paper. She said, "Ms. Holt, my name is Edna Storrow." Cassie went very still. The woman said, "I saw the article on Friday morning. I read the name of the house in the third paragraph, and I couldn't understand at first why I stopped when I read it, why I couldn't continue reading, and set it down and sat there for a long time." She held out the folded paper. "I have a photograph," she said, "that belonged to my grandmother, of a house. She never explained it or talked about it. She just kept it her whole life. When she died, she left it to my mother, and my mother left it to me, and I kept it in a drawer because I didn't know what else to do with something I couldn't understand." Cassie took the paper, opened it. A photocopy of a photograph, old and slightly blurred from the reproduction, showing a stone house in morning light. 3 stories, narrow windows, a covered porch with stone columns. Ivy just beginning at the base of the west wall, a few tentative runners, not yet the thick ropes it would become. Stonehaven, 1919 or close to it, before any of it. Edna Storrow said, "My grandmother never talked about the house, but she kept that photograph. I never knew why. I never knew where it was. I kept it in the drawer because it felt wrong to throw away something that had mattered that much to someone." She looked at Cassie. She said, "I didn't know." Cassie held the photocopy in both hands. She thought about Edward Giddens's 4 lines. Meeting held. Terms established. Documents prepared. Transfer executed. She thought about the Storrow family living in that house for 48 years, cutting the stone from the ridge, fitting it together, laying the tile, training the ivy, and then being removed from it in 4 lines of careful handwriting that they would never read, filed in a room under the house they had built with their own hands. She thought about what she held in her jacket pocket. The deed, her name on it, legally, entirely, unambiguously hers. She thought about the difference between what is legally true and what is humanly right, and how that distance is sometimes the exact distance between a system working as designed and justice. She said, "Can you come inside?" Patricia Crane spent 40 minutes in the library with Edna Storrow and a notary who arrived at 5:30 with a stamp and the professional equanimity of someone who has seen unusual circumstances before and has learned that the purpose of the form is to witness the decision, not to judge it. The document was straightforward: a voluntary transfer of deed, Stonehaven Estate and its 12.4 acres from Cassie Holt to Edna Storrow, without consideration, without condition, without reservation of any kind. Cassie signed it at the reading table under the chandelier above the Persian rug with its closed hatch in the basement full of documents that had already served their purpose. Edna Storrow sat across the table and watched her sign. When the notary's stamp came down, Edna pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Cassie. She said, "I don't know how to say what this is." Cassie said, "You don't have to." She capped the pen and set it on the table. She said, "Just take care of it." The ruling came on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the hearing. One page, black ink, signed, motion denied, injunction lifted. The published materials and the process by which they were obtained were protected under the provisions afforded to investigative journalism and whistleblower testimony. The court found no sufficient cause to suppress either the published material or the process by which it was obtained. Cassie read the ruling 3 times in her kitchen, barefoot, coffee in hand. The house was quiet around her. Outside, a clear, cold morning, light was working its way through the pines on the ridge. Warren Giddens was indicted on 18 federal counts the following Monday: fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering, civil rights violations. 4 additional defendants from the list in Cabinet 43 were named. The 5th, the retired circuit court judge from Birch Creek Road, the man who had slid an envelope across a diner table and waited for a hand that never reached for it, had entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office 2 weeks prior to the indictment. His name did not appear in the filing. His cooperation had been the price of that. His conscience, whatever remained of it after 40 years, was between himself and whatever he believed in. Beckett Giddens received a deferred prosecution agreement in exchange for his testimony and the financial records he had provided. He left Copper Falls 2 weeks after the ruling and did not return. Cassie thought about the brass key on the marble table one final time, and then she stopped thinking about it. Some things are what they are, neither more nor less, and putting more weight on them than they will hold does not serve anyone. The Stonehaven Archive opened on a Saturday in early spring, 3 months after the ruling, on a day when the dogwoods along the Ridge Road were in the first stages of blooming, and the light had the particular quality of light in the mountains in April, thin and clear and without the heaviness of summer. Edna Storrow had worked with a preservation architect through the winter months. The West Wing had been stabilized, and the library had been fitted with climate-controlled display cases that held documents from the archive mounted behind protective glass. Each one labeled with the name of the property it concerned and the name of the family it had been taken from in matching typefaces with equal weight. The main basement had been converted into a research space, its filing cabinets accessible to anyone who came with a legitimate purpose and the patience to sit with what was inside them. Archive Room C had been sealed per the Federal Evidence Preservation Order, its contents cataloged and held, but a full photographic record of its interior was mounted on the corridor wall above the sealed steel door so that anyone who came to Stonehaven could see what had been down there and understand what it meant that it had been there for decades. The spiral staircase was preserved and visible through a glass panel set into the floor of the servants' corridor. Helen Marsh came on opening day and walked through the library, slowly reading each display case with the unhurried attention of a woman who had earned the right to take her time with this. She stood for a long time in front of the case that held her cassette tapes sealed in archival bags, their hand-lettered labels visible behind the glass. She said nothing. She put her palm flat on the glass for a moment, the way you put your hand on a door to feel what's on the other side. Then she moved on. Dale Pruitt brought his daughter and his 2 grandchildren. His daughter had been 9 years old in 1992 and had grown up in a house with the weight of that loss in it, absorbing it the way children absorb the atmosphere of the rooms they live in, without understanding it and without being entirely free of it. She stood in the research space and read the documents relating to her family's property for a long time. When she came out, she looked at her father and started to say something and stopped. He nodded once. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Virgil Tatum came alone and stayed for 3 hours and left without speaking to anyone except to thank Edna Storrow at the door, a brief exchange, the words less important than the act of saying them. Nora Sloan did not come to the opening. She was in Kentucky, 2 counties east, in a different diner, at a different booth, with a different folder, listening to a different man tell her about a piece of land that had been taken from his family in 1974. The work had a way of continuing. That was the thing about work like this. It never arrived at a complete stop. It just moved to the next place where it was needed. Frank Aldridge arrived late in the afternoon when most of the visitors had gone, and the rooms had settled into the particular quiet of a space that has been full of people and has now been returned to itself. He walked through the library without stopping at the display cases, through the foyer and down the hall, moving through the house with the familiarity of someone who had spent months in its rooms and had come to know its specific language, its particular vocabulary of sounds and silences. He stopped in the library at the reading table. On it sat the new guest book, a bound volume with cream-colored pages and a good pen laid beside it. The first pages were already filling with names and notes from the day's visitors, handwriting in every style, brief and lengthy, formal and plain, some in pencil and some in ink. Frank looked at the book for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about what to say to it. Then he picked up the pen. He wrote in the deliberate hand of a man who has thought about every word before committing it to paper, who understands that some things said in writing have a permanence that things said aloud do not. He wrote, "I should have done this 30 years ago. I am glad someone finally did." He set the pen down. He stood with his hands still resting on the table for a moment, not moving, just being in the room. Then he straightened, walked back through the house to the front door, and stepped outside into the late afternoon light. Cassie found the list in her jacket pocket 2 days later. She was at the garage in Delwood, her hands inside the engine of a truck someone had brought in from 2 counties over, because the word had spread that she was the best diagnostic mechanic between Harlan and Middlesbrough, and she reached into her pocket for a shop rag, and her hand closed around a folded piece of paper instead. She pulled it out, the ones who stayed quiet. She had kept it folded in her inside pocket since the night she found it, and it had traveled through every subsequent week, in every subsequent event, through every difficult room and every difficult decision, without her ever once deliberately deciding to keep it there. It had simply stayed. She unfolded it under the fluorescent light. 33 names, 33 property numbers. The brief, terse notations of what had been done to each person and how. She turned it over. Helen Marsh. She recorded everything. She read it once more. Then she folded it again and held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper. Outside the garage door, the day was cold and bright, the kind of clear late winter day that happens in the mountains, when the weather is resting between one hard thing and the next, taking a breath. She walked out and stood into the parking lot and looked north toward the ridge, at the line of hills, running toward Copper Falls, at the place somewhere beyond what she could see, where the gravel road climbed through the pines and ended at an iron gate. She thought about what it cost to hold on to something for 50 years. The Storrow family holding on to a photograph of a house they had lost before most of them were born. Helen Marsh holding on to cassette tapes in a locked box in a false-walled attic space for 40 years. Dale Pruitt holding on to documents and to the belief, despite all the pressure he had been under, to give it up, that he had not made a mistake, that it had not been his fault. Frank Aldridge holding on to a shoebox wrapped in fraying twine, and the conscience that the shoebox represented the part of himself that refused to be entirely reconciled to what he had done, the cost of holding on. The particular quiet, sustaining cost of not letting go of something, even when letting go would be so much easier. Even when no one is watching. Even when there is no visible reason to believe it will ever matter to anyone. It always matters. Somewhere eventually to someone. It always matters. She put the list back in her inside pocket. She went back into the garage. She picked up her wrench and went back to work. That night, driving home on the county road with the radio off and the window cracked despite the cold, she passed the turnoff for the Ridge Road. She didn't turn in. She didn't need to. She kept driving, and in the rearview mirror, the darkness of the tree line gave way for a moment to the faint warm light visible between the pines high on the ridge, where a house built of mountain stone in 1919 was standing with its windows lit and its doors open. She watched it in the mirror until the road curved and the trees closed behind her and the light was gone. Then she looked ahead at the road and drove on,